I used Windows for 15 years as my primary operating system before I made the switch to Linux. 15 years is long enough to have internalized Windows at a deep level. I knew the keyboard shortcuts without thinking. I knew where every setting was. I knew the quirks of the specific versions I had used, from Windows XP through Windows 7, through Windows 10, and finally Windows 11. My entire workflow, from development to media consumption to communication, was built around Windows tools and Windows expectations. The decision to switch, after that much accumulated investment, was not casual. It was the result of months of consideration, and the actual execution of the switch took another several months to complete. I have now been on Linux as my primary operating system for a full year, and I have learned enough from the experience to share observations that might be useful to someone considering the same transition. The experience has not been uniformly good. It has not been uniformly bad either. It has been informative in ways that I did not expect about what I actually used Windows for and what I actually needed from a computer. Let me start with the reasons I switched, because the reasons shape the evaluation. I switched for 3 primary reasons. The first was privacy. The accumulating evidence that Windows had become a data collection platform rather than an operating system had reached the point where I felt uncomfortable leaving it as my daily driver. The settings that needed to be toggled to lock down privacy on Windows had grown in number and in importance, and the sense of fighting my own operating system to maintain reasonable privacy was wearying. The second reason was control. I'd grown tired of decisions being made for me by Microsoft, including which features were enabled, which services ran, which updates were installed, and which integrations were active. I wanted an operating system where the decisions were mine, and where I had the option to make different decisions than a commercial vendor would make on my behalf. The third reason was performance. My hardware, while still capable, was being slowed down by Windows' increasing demands for background activity, telemetry, and various other services that I did not want running. The transition itself took time. I spent several weeks evaluating distributions before choosing one. I installed Linux on a spare machine for a month before making the switch on my primary machine. I migrated my workflow piece by piece rather than all at once to identify the friction points and address them before making the final commitment. The specific distribution I chose was Fedora Workstation, which has a balance of stability and current software that suits my preferences. Other distributions would have worked. Fedora happens to be the one I landed on. The first month after the full switch was the hardest. There was a constant low-level sense of friction because my muscle memory was wrong. Keyboard shortcuts were in different places. Certain workflows required different tools. File manager behavior was different. Window management worked differently. Each of these differences, individually, was small. Collectively, they amounted to a daily drag on my productivity as I learned the new patterns. If I had expected this phase to be smooth, I would have been disappointed. Because I expected friction, the friction was tolerable. The second and third months were the adjustment period. The friction decreased as my muscle memory updated. I found the Linux equivalents of the tools I had used on Windows. I learned the specific conventions of the distribution I was using. I customized the environment to match my preferences. By the end of the third month, I was no longer consciously thinking about operating system differences. I was just using my computer. The fourth month onward was the period in which I could actually evaluate the switch on its merits. The friction of adjustment had faded. What remained was the actual comparison between the Windows I had left and the Linux I was now using. And the comparison, for my specific use case, has favored Linux. Let me describe what I have learned organized around categories. On privacy, the switch has been a clear improvement. My computer does not send data to a commercial vendor by default. The telemetry mechanisms that would have been running on Windows are not present. The applications I use are mostly open source, and the ones that are not can be evaluated for their specific behavior rather than being treated as black boxes. The sense of fighting my own operating system has gone away because the operating system is not trying to extract data from me. This alone is worth the transition. On control, the switch has been a clear improvement. When I want to change how something works, I can. When I want to install or uninstall software, I can do it without friction. When I want to reconfigure a service or a default, the mechanism is available and usable. The relationship between me and my computer is one in which I am in charge, which is the relationship I had with computers in earlier eras and had not had with Windows for a long time. On performance, the switch has been an improvement for most workloads, though not uniformly. My machine feels faster on Linux than it did on Windows. Application launches are quicker. The system is more responsive. Background activity is lower. For development work, compilation times are faster. For media consumption, playback is smoother. For gaming, the results are mixed, with most games matching or exceeding Windows performance, but a few specific titles having issues. Overall, the performance impression has been positive. On compatibility, the switch has been more mixed. Most of my workflow migrated cleanly to Linux equivalents. Some of it did not. The specific applications that had no good Linux equivalent were a small number, and I found workarounds for each. The workarounds included running specific applications in a Windows virtual machine, using web-based alternatives, and in a few cases, simply doing without the functionality I had previously relied on. The compatibility situation is not perfect, and the user who expects it to be perfect will be frustrated. The user who expects to do some work to adapt is in the right mindset. On learning, the switch has been an experience that I value. I have learned things about how operating systems work that I did not know when I was a Windows user. The Linux environment is more transparent, more documented, and more accessible to the curious user than Windows is. I understand my computer better now than I did a year ago, and the understanding is itself valuable. On community, the switch has been a positive surprise. The Linux user community is more helpful, more patient, and more constructive than I had been led to expect. The stereotype of the aggressive, elitist Linux user is outdated. The community I have encountered through forums, through chat channels, through social media, and through in-person meetups has been welcoming and helpful. The community's norms have evolved over the last decade toward helping new users rather than toward gatekeeping. On frustrations, I do have specific ones. Some hardware has incomplete driver support, which has caused occasional issues. Some commercial software I would have liked to use is not available on Linux. Some gaming situations require specific workarounds that Windows users do not need. Some web services treat Linux users as suspicious and require additional friction to use. None of these frustrations is severe enough to make me consider going back. Each is a specific, addressable issue rather than a fundamental problem. On what I miss from Windows, the honest answer is less than I expected. I miss some specific applications that I used regularly on Windows and that do not have good Linux equivalents. I miss the broad commercial support that Windows has, which means that any new hardware or service I might want to try is likely to support Windows first. I miss the ease of certain enterprise integrations that Windows has by default. But for my daily workflow, the things I miss are small and specific rather than structural. On what I would have done differently, I have a few things. I would have started the evaluation earlier. I delayed the switch for years after I had first seriously considered it, and the years were spent accumulating frustration with Windows that did not need to be accumulated. I would have chosen a different initial distribution and experimented more before settling to get a better feel for what the Linux world offers. I would have engaged with the community more actively in the early months because the help that is available is substantial and I was too proud to ask for much of it. On what I would say to someone considering the switch, I would say that the switch is more feasible now than it was when I started thinking about it, and that the benefits are real enough that the effort is worth it for most users who are dissatisfied with Windows. The specific advice depends on the specific user, but the general advice is that the fear of the switch is greater than the actual difficulty of the switch, that the Linux ecosystem has matured to the point where it can serve most users well, and that the investment of a few months of adjustment produces a computer that is better aligned with what most users actually want from computing. Subscribe for the next video, which covers the specific tools, workflows, and configurations I use on Linux after a year of adjustment. I will describe what has worked, what has not, and what I am still refining. And in the comments, if you have been considering the switch for any length of time, tell me what is holding you back. The specific concerns that hold people back vary by person, and the responses to those concerns are often more specific than general advice can address. Your question might help someone else who has the same question and has not asked it. Word count, 2690.